I may be fasting. But if while fasting I'm still thinking of food, especially the food that I'll eat when I break the fast, then the fast is not of much use. We are currently on a series based on a compilation of the mother's works, The Great Adventure. And today's passage is entitled Renunciation. It's on page 48 of this compilation. The mother says, "There is in books a lot of talk about renunciation, that you must renounce possessions, renounce attachments, renounce desires. But I have come to the conclusion that so long as you have to renounce anything, you are not on this path, for so long as you are not thoroughly disgusted with things as they are and have to make an effort to reject them, you are not ready for the supramental realization. To renounce means that you are to give up what you value, that you have to discard what you think is worth keeping. What, on the contrary, you must feel is that this world is ugly, stupid, brutal, and full of intolerable suffering, and once you feel in this way, all the physical, all the material consciousness, which does not want it to be that, will want it to change, crying, 'I will have something else, something that is true, beautiful, full of delight and knowledge and consciousness.'" The mother has touched in this passage a very important idea associated with the sadhana on the spiritual path, and that is renunciation. Now, in relation to renunciation, there are three basic questions that are common in relation to any important subject that we shall try and see: what, why, and how. Now, renunciation. What is renunciation? When I was at school, there were often questions in the examination like this: what do you know about, for example, what do you know about renunciation? And a joke that went around was that if the student writes, "I know nothing about renunciation," he should get 100% marks. So all the examiner is asked, "What do you know about renunciation?" The student has told, frankly, "I know nothing about renunciation." Anyway, coming to it a little more seriously, renunciation is a simple word, and rather a complicated word for a simple idea. All what it means is giving up. But in relation to renunciation, it's not just what it is, but also what to renounce. So the what in relation to renunciation also means what to renounce. And the mother has listed a few things there. We often think of renouncing possessions, relationships, attachments, work, and so on. And it could apply to all these and a lot more. Sometimes we talk of total renunciation, rejecting and giving up everything in the world, as if that were possible. The next question is, why should we renounce? One would give up something only if one finds that it is no longer interesting. There's a story about a young boy once asking Swami Chinmayananda, "Why have you renounced all worldly things?" And at that moment, that boy probably happened to have a chewing gum in his mouth. So Swamiji asked him, "Will you keep this chewing gum in your mouth forever?" He said, "No. When I feel there's no more juice coming out of it, I'll throw it away." So Swami Chinmayananda told him, "I also chewed a lot on the world. When there was no more juice coming, I threw it." That's how I gave it up. Which in other words means that we renounce something when it is no longer interesting to us. And that is what happens with all worldly things. After a point, we get saturated with it. We feel that it is no longer as interesting, as pleasing as it was once, and like the chewing gum, we throw it. However, that is not all. There is something a little deeper sometimes which strikes us, and that's why we give it up. Because we realize that we are finding something interesting, it's giving us a certain type of pleasure, and therefore gradually we find that we start getting dependent on it for our happiness. And then at some deeper level we realize that it is not going to be with us forever. And therefore we can visualize that since we have become dependent on it for our happiness, when we lose it, it will be a painful process. In anticipation of that pain, we decide why not give it up. Doesn't look very wise, because at least while it is there, why not enjoy it? Why give it up in anticipation of the pain? When it will happen, it will. Why give it up right now? Now, while we are doing that, there is something still deeper which sometimes strikes us, and that is, let us give it up for the sake of something which will not go away. The worldly things, possessions, relationships, and so on, these are all things we know they are not going to last forever. But is there something that is going to last forever? And then it starts making more sense, because a person can more easily give up something if in exchange he can get something which is still better. It's easy to give up an old-fashioned, big, fat, curved screen TV if I can get a thin screen, flat screen TV. Then there's no problem in giving it up. So if I get something better, then it is easier to give it up. And we realize, yes, there is something that will last forever, that will never go away, and that is the divine. And therefore, for the sake of the divine, I am ready to give up something which will not last forever, which in any case will go away. Why make myself dependent on that thing which will go away for my happiness? Why not instead turn to something which will never go away? Now, that now still makes still more sense. And then, we start thinking, can I have both? That also is possible. Is it necessary to give up something which I am liking right now? I know it will go away, but right now it is quite pleasing. Is it necessary to give that up for the sake of getting that which will last forever? Now this becomes a difficult question, and it is in relation to that the third question, how to give up, becomes important. But before we go to that, on the whole, the overall conclusion is that yes, giving up at least some of these worldly things seems to be necessary for getting that higher thing which will never go away, which will never delude us. That is the general sort of a conclusion which religious and spiritual disciplines across the world have come to, that yes, we have to give up something to get something. We have to give up some of these ordinary worldly pleasures for the sake of getting that one supreme delight, that bliss which comes only from the divine. And to understand that, let's take a simple example why that is necessary. Once I was going from Chennai with the idea of going to Mahabalipuram. A car was available to take me from Chennai to Mahabalipuram and bring me back. But then the time was limited. We had left sometime in the afternoon, and we had to come back by the evening. I knew the time is limited. But then after we had driven hardly 15 minutes, it occurred to us we had not yet taken lunch. So let's stop somewhere for lunch and then we'll go. So we stopped somewhere at some restaurant, spent 1 hour having lunch. And then again started driving towards Mahabalipuram. After some time, after driving about an hour, came a place with very attractive billboards which said, there's a beautiful crocodile farm here. Some of you have been there. Actually, it's a real incident. It's not not making it up. There's a crocodile farm. The billboard seemed very attractive. Why not stop here and have a look at the crocodile farm before we go to Mahabalipuram? We went there. By the time we came out of the crocodile farm, we felt that if we go to Mahabalipuram, we'll not be able to come back in time. So we drove back from the crocodile farm back to Chennai. Never reached Mahabalipuram. Now that is what happens. If we had decided, well, lunch is not so important, we can, instead of stopping at a restaurant, let's just stop at a shop which is selling either bananas or biscuits, get those and eat that in the car. No matter how attractive the billboards of that crocodile farm are, we'll not stop here. Let's go to Mahabalipuram. If there will be time, we'll go into the crocodile farm on our way back. Now, if we had decided that, we would have reached Mahabalipuram and seen it. Now, Mahabalipuram is like the divine that we are talking about. What happens is that if we get deeply engaged in everything that comes on our way, all the worldly attachments and possessions and everything, and get deeply involved in it, we may never get to Mahabalipuram. And that is why giving up some of these things is important to get there. And that is why it becomes important. As Sri Aurobindo says, that giving up or renouncing gives a momentum, direction and character to our sadhana. It acquires momentum. Momentum, I think, is the very important word. Because it acquires that speed, it acquires that push, it acquires that momentum through renunciation. And therefore, renunciation is important. It's not that one can have everything. And believe me, and I got a second chance to go to Mahabalipuram after nearly 15 years. 15 years passed before I did finally go to Mahabalipuram, and that's what happens in this journey of the soul also. We don't get to the divine in this life, and then we have to wait for the next life. And that's how the journey of the soul goes on life after life. Just as here it was just 15 years, in our journey of the soul, life after life, it could be thousands of years. And that's why giving up is important. But then at the same time, the mother has made an important point when she says that you should not feel that you are giving up. Because if I am feeling that pain of giving up, then it is not really giving up. Because I should realize the value of what I am giving it up for. And if I really value that and I love that, then giving up will not be painful. And therefore, one should not give up with the idea of giving up. One should have developed that sense of detachment, that inner detachment, which comes from realizing the flimsy character of what I am attached to, as well as the bliss and the permanent character of what I am giving it up for. And that is important. Now, this is where how we give up becomes important. We have seen what giving up is and why we should give up. The next third question is how to give up. In the Gita, there are two words that have been used, sannyas and tyag. And very often the two are equated. But in fact, the two are not. The Gita has distinguished between them, and Sri Aurobindo has emphasized that distinction. Sannyas is outer and physical renunciation. That is, physically, outwardly, materially, actually giving up something. That is sannyas. And the extremes of sannyas are retiring to a mountain or to a cave, trying to live on the bare minimum, giving up all worldly possessions, minimum of clothes, minimum of food, and living under austere conditions on a mountain or in a cave. That is the extreme of sannyas. Tyag is something different. Tyag is also giving up. In the English language, probably we don't have two separate words of these two for these two different types of giving up. But the sannyas and tyag, although they both mean giving up, the idea is different. Sannyas is outer physical renunciation and can be carried to extremes. Tyag, on the other hand, is inner and psychological rather than outer and physical, which means that one has been able to overcome the attachment. And when that attachment has been overcome, then the renunciation becomes more meaningful. As Sri Aurobindo says in the essays on the Gita somewhere, something to the effect that without inner renunciation, outer renunciation is not of much use. And with inner renunciation, outer renunciation may not be necessary, but it is not forbidden and it is likely to follow. Which means that if one has been able to inwardly achieve that detachment, how much we give up outside is not really important, and therefore it may not be necessary to go to those extremes. But at the same time, some degree of outer renunciation is also likely to follow, and it is not forbidden. One can go to any extreme one likes to. But then one has to go to that because one feels like it, because one enjoys it, because one is not missing what one is giving up. For example, suppose I get that thin screen, flat screen TV. I still have not given up that curved one, that old-fashioned with the curved screen. I just put it in the garage. I don't give it away. I put it in the garage. It collects dust there. It still belongs to me. It's my possession. I haven't given it away. I haven't really physically renounced it. But all the same, I'm not attached to it. I'm not thinking about it. I've just pushed it in a corner. That is as good as renouncing it. Inwardly, I have renounced it. So in the same way, it's not necessary that I give up all my possessions and actually go to a mountain. Even the possessions that I have kept, if I am not attached to them, I have inwardly renounced them. I've just pushed them in a corner, I put them in the garage. So we can put them in the garage of our mind somewhere, let them collect dust there. I'm not attached to them. That is what is important. And Sri Aurobindo has emphasized this a lot because although the Gita does clearly distinguish between sannyas and tyag, and emphasizes the value of tyag as compared to simple sannyas, in which one has renounced everything outwardly without actually giving it up within. The Gita has emphasized it somewhere over the 3,000 years that have passed since the Gita was written. This message was lost on this country. And particularly over the last 1,000 years or so, we started seeing a clear dichotomy between worldly life and spiritual life, and started equating spiritual life with total outer physical renunciation, and that naturally made spirituality suitable for a select few, because that is a path that will appeal and will be suitable for just a few, and that is what we started equating spirituality with. And that did us a lot of damage, both in the spiritual area as well as on the worldly plane. In the spiritual area, because then we forgot that spirituality could also be brought into worldly life, and that the worldly life is also a manifestation of the divine, and therefore it can be transformed to befit the one that it manifests. That is something we forgot. And on the worldly plane also we lost, because we didn't respect matter and worldly life enough, because we didn't see the divine in it, and therefore declined also in that area. We neglected matter without appreciating the spirit in the matter, and the result was that materially also we underwent a decline. Till the 10th century, in terms of whether it was science and technology, whether it was industry, whether it was wealth, whatever it was, India was amongst the leaders in the world. And it's not that India at that time was any less spiritual than it is today. So spirituality is not something which is unworldly or only otherworldly. Spirituality can be brought right into this world in our everyday life, and that is what Sri Aurobindo emphasized, and that is why it is important to understand the distinction between sannyas and tyag. Even those who sometimes distinguish it these days sometimes misinterpret the message of the Gita, and they feel that tyag is only a preparation for sannyas. That, okay, it is all right to give up only inwardly, attach that sense of detachment, but it is a preparation for the total outer renunciation, a completely giving up everything and finally going away outside this world, somewhere to a mountain. Tyag is not a preparation for sannyas. Tyag in itself is enough, because without tyag, sannyas, as Sri Aurobindo has said, or outer renunciation, without the tyag, just sannyas does not have much meaning. It will not be an effective force in the sadhana. Because what will happen is that one will still be thinking about what one has given up. One has given up but has not given up inwardly, and therefore the pain of giving up is still there. So it causes stress. For example, I may be fasting, but if while fasting I am still thinking of food, especially the food that I'll eat when I break the fast, then the fast is not of much use. So giving up just outwardly is not enough. On the other hand, if that inward renunciation has been achieved, then outer renunciation is not necessary, but all the same it is likely to follow. It's likely to follow because I cannot keep all the outer things and still turn to that divine which I have now made my mission. And that is because, as I was saying, if we have too many distractions on the way, then we will never get there. Like, I never got to Mahabalipuram because decided to have lunch and go to the crocodile farm. So that is what can happen to anybody. Then, in the Gita has also distinguished between different types of tyag, because even tyag need not be just one entity. Tyag can also have a tamasic, rajasic, and a sattvic character, and one can go even beyond sattva. So that applies even to tyag. Now, what is tamasic tyag? The person has given up, but the person has given up with the idea that just giving up is enough for liberation. Now, this particularly applies to work, because the Gita has emphasized work. Gita is a gospel of action. A tamasic person can say that, well, I have given up work because this worldly work is of no use. I have turned to the divine, and just giving up this work will itself take me to the divine. Now, this can be a tamasic tyag. The person has given up work. The person has given up maybe many other things in the world also, because if he doesn't work, then, naturally he doesn't have much possessions, and he says that, well, I hardly keep anything with me and I don't do any work. Now I'll reach the divine. Now that is a tamasic type of tyag. The person is basically lazy, and therefore he is ready to keep only the minimum, do with the minimum, somehow manage with the minimum, because one thing he doesn't want to do is to work. He is basically lazy. And that will not actually be enough to take him to that. Liberation will not provide him, take him to the divine. That is tamasic tyaga. What is rajasic tyag? Rajasic tyag is because when the person finds that when I do something, when I put in all the hard work, I do not get enough of a fruit. I do not get the type of fruit that I wanted. I get a lot of trouble and sorrow with that work, and therefore I will not work, or I'll give up something because it is bringing me pain, it's bringing me problems, it's bringing me trouble. And rajas, as basically a mental characteristic, the person calculates so much going in, so much coming out. Input is this much, output is that much, and therefore, because the output is not being matched by the input, I give it up. Now that is a rajasic tyaga. What is sattvic tyag? Sattvic tyag is giving up for the sake of something higher, for the sake of something better. And even that is not enough, because even sattvic tyag can be associated with a strong ego and strong worldly desires. I'll give you one example of a man who had been in business for some time, and then he felt that I have earned enough. I can live the rest of my life easily with whatever I have already made, and therefore let me now give something back to the society. He wound up his business, gave up his work, and decided to go and volunteer his time at some NGO so that he could do something for others. Very noble idea, sattvic renunciation. He didn't give it up because he was disgusted with his business. He didn't give it up because he was finding that the output is not matched by the input. He had not become lazy. He was still ready to work. So neither tamasic nor rajasic. It was a sattvic renunciation. But then what happened was that when he actually started going to those NGOs, instead of doing something good there, he started finding faults with each one of them. He started finding that this is wrong here, this is wrong there, why are they not doing this like this, why are they not doing this like that? And therefore, he kept leaving one NGO after another. Because he found faults everywhere, he found that they were not as good as he had imagined, they were not doing as much good work as they had imagined, and sometimes, if didn't find enough faults, he found that what he was doing was not creating enough of an impact. He was not able to change the world by what he was doing. I mean, he had exaggerated ideas about how he will be able to change the society, how he will be able to change the world, what impact he will make by giving up. And he felt that, well, I have given up so much, and what's... So it means that Rajasic streak came back. He started with a Sattvic idea, but when Rajas took over, and he could not separate clearly that ego and that desire to see the world changing, and that ego that I have done it, I am doing it, I have given up, now I am doing this. And the same ego also finding faults with wherever he went. The result was that he started going into a depression. Why did I do it all? For whom? For what? Little realizing that there can be a strong ego associated also with sattva. This was his sattvic ego at work. And what one has to realize is that in the ultimate analysis, when one takes some such step, one is still an instrument of the divine, one is not the doer. And it's not because the world will change out of what we do, it's because our own consciousness will grow. That is what is most important. In that sense, at that level, such actions also remain personal and selfish. But that is the type of selfishness and self-centeredness which is a sort of permissible self-centeredness. And therefore, to expect that the world will change as a result of this, yes, in a very broad sense, world does change, because everyone who takes some such step is not only elevating his consciousness, he is also sending some vibrations out which are influencing others and helping others rise in consciousness. And if there is enough number of people in the world who are working towards a rise in consciousness, we can reach a point where we get to that critical mass which can start influencing the way the affairs of the world will be conducted. That is what Sri Aurobindo's idea of a collective rise in the level of consciousness is. That if enough people collaborate with nature in this process of rise of consciousness, then we could accelerate that process and soon enough reach a point where the way the world is run will change. Instead of remaining a world that is driven by individual egos, instead of having primarily ego-driven personalities, we'll have enough of personalities which are driven from a higher motive. Which means there has been enough of a transformation for this individual ego to fall in line with the psychic being, to start working in tune with the psychic being. And when that happens, the world will become a much better place to live in. So in that sense, every single individual who is taking such a step is not only rising in consciousness himself, is also contributing to that collective process. But to see that there will be a visible and remarkable and palpable change as a result of taking any such step, and then getting disappointed and frustrated because of it, once again is not in tune with the spirit of the Gita, which wants us not to cling to the fruit, not to expect a particular type of fruit, not to be attached to the fruit. And therefore, how we give up is as important as giving up. Firstly, it has to be primarily tyag rather than sannyas. Sannyas to some extent may follow, but then that is a corollary to the tyaga, the inner renunciation, and not the primary step. And secondly, within that tyaga also, we have to move from tamas to rajas and rajas to sattva, and then beyond sattva as in any other tendency. So that applies to tyaga as much as to all the other work that we do. Now let us see how it applies actually to the process of giving up. to some of the things that we commonly talk about. Possessions. Yes, possessions need to be given up. Some of the possessions which we feel are obstructing our progress, which are not necessary, which are better to share with others rather than to keep them ourselves. Yes, those possessions can be given up, but then with that idea of not being attached to them, exactly the way we give up that TV after we get a better one. So with that type of a detachment, if we can give up, yes, the possessions should be given up. How about relationships? Now that also presents a very difficult problem, because that becomes a major obstacle on the path of sadhana. Relationships that we have developed over decades, close relatives, friends, what should we do about that? Does it mean that, once again, what would be the equivalent of sannyas? One fine day, we just send an email or make a phone call to each one of them. From tomorrow, I have decided to renounce, so I'll never talk to you, I'll never see you from now onwards. That is one way of doing it. That would be sannyas. But then if the attachment has not actually gone, it will not serve much purpose. So that's why what the mother has said is that our relationships should change towards a continuing egoless kindness, which means the ego should go, the kindness and goodwill should continue. That is what is important. Which means that, let's see, where is the ego there? It's the ego that gives rise to the attachment. When one of the persons who is close to us dies, whom are we really crying for? The person who has died is at peace. If we really love that person and the person whom we love is at peace, why are we crying? We are crying because we were attached to that person. We are missing the pleasure which we were getting from the company of that person. So that is what we are missing. Which means that ultimately still that remains an attachment. It remains an expression of our own ego. For example, some boy say he's called Pappu, or whatever, nickname. When both his parents and all the other elderly relatives were gone, when the last elderly relative dies, he started crying, now who will ever call me Pappu? Now you see, which means that he's not really thinking of all those who have died. What he's thinking about is the pleasure that now he will never get again because nobody will call him Pappu. You see, that is what is important. Which means that basically we are, that attachment is what we have to overcome, not the relationship itself. So that applies just also to the tyaga, and a proper tyaga applies as much to relationships as it does to possessions. The same about work. People are very often willing to give up the fruit. Well, I don't want any reward, I don't want any recognition. They are also prepared to accept some sort of giving up of doership. I am only an instrument of the divine, I am not doing the work myself. But what they cannot give up is the idea of the work itself, or a particular type of work, a preference for a work. Now those are also again born in our ego. Because, for example, when people are nearing retirement, even those who are not worried about losing the income, losing the position, one thing they start feeling is, what will I do when I get up in the morning? I got so used to getting ready and going for work. And he starts dropping hints to his people in his office or wherever he's working. Well, I'm still ready to work, whatever you want. Will not take any money. It doesn't matter if the position is gone. Or at least I can come for some time every day. If whatever work is available, you can give me that work, or I'll just have a cup of tea with you and go away. That sort of hints they start dropping. Why do they do that? Because they got very attached to the work itself. So the idea is, just as, we can keep the possessions and still be not attached, we can continue working and still be not attached to the work. And the preference for the work, that is again an ego. I have been doing this type of work, so I'm attached to only this type of work. I can do only this type of work. This is the only type of work for which I am fit. Now, yes, there are certain types of work for which we are more fit. And that is what swabhava is, the idea of swabhava. But then, because of the ego getting mixed up with what we think our swabhava is, our swabhava appears to us much more restricted than it actually is. We don't understand our own swabhava once the ego steps in. And the root cause of the likings and preferences is something else, and the expression we give it becomes something else. Well, this is something which I cannot do, this is something which I am not made for. We start blaming the swabhava where actually what is involved is something different. So once we understand our swabhava properly, in the true sense, and get that ego out of it, we find that we are fit for a much larger variety of works than what we think we are suitable for. And in that sense, some work will always be available. Some objects of our work will always be available. Whether it is work in the form of a physical support, whether it is in the form of the type of work that we have been doing, or whether it is just providing psychological support, emotional support to people, there will be always some type of thing, because there's no dearth of objects of love who are available around us. Basically, it's a question of giving. Giving becomes the primary concern rather than getting, that is getting, even if it's not material benefits, getting happiness, getting recognition, getting reward, getting the satisfaction of seeing a certain type of result being achieved, certain type of change in the coming about in the world. Now that is also a type of getting, wanting to get that satisfaction of the world changing as a result of what I am doing. Once the focus shifts from getting to just giving, there will always be work available, there will always be joy of work also available. So in other words, the master renunciation remains renouncing the ego and the desires. That is what is important. Once we give that up, then how much physically we give up, how much sannyasa we actually take becomes immaterial. Some sannyasa will follow automatically, that will come, and that becomes important to avoid all the distractions and obstructions which possessions and attachments can create. So some of it is bound to follow, but that is not the primary thing, that is secondary, that is a corollary. The primary thing remains giving up our ego and desires. And what is the underlying cause of the ego and the desires? Avidya. Which means giving up of the ignorance is what is important. Ignorance of the basic facts of existence, that is who I truly am and what I am here in the world for. These two basic existential questions, if we understand that, then the ego goes. And if the ego goes, the desires also go. As Sri Aurobindo has said, the desires starve in the absence of support from the ego. Because the ego and the desires are closely linked. Much of our desires are not related to our wants. Much of our desires are not even related to what the world needs. Much of our desires are also an expression of our ego. I have clothes, enough clothes to last me years. I want some more clothes because that somehow boosts my ego. There is enough of social work going on in the world, but I also want to contribute to this. I want to do social work. I want to see the world change as a result of that social work. That boosts my ego. So whatever type of thing we get into as a result of a desire, whether it's desire for possessing more or whether it's desire for helping some people, there could be an ego behind it. And that is what creates the desire. If we can have that same desire to help, that same desire to give, that same desire to love, without this ego coming in, and that can be based only on knowledge, not on ignorance, then all these problems automatically disappear, the problems which we have been talking about. So it means the basic thing that we have to give up is the ego. If the ego goes, the desires starve in the absence of this support. There's a little story that illustrates this very well. There was a person who was in a very agitated state, and he went to a Swamiji in a very disturbed voice saying, I want peace, I want peace, I want peace. So he was told, well, give up that I. And then he started saying, want peace, want peace, want peace. And he told him, give up the want, peace, peace, peace. So then, told him, well, you have got what you wanted. That is what is left behind. Now, what this story illustrates is that when we say, I want peace, I is the ego and want is the desire. So first when he was told to give up the I, that is the ego, what was left behind was want peace. Now, want peace is a very weak sentence. It's a lifeless sentence as compared to I want peace. When we take that I away, the intensity of that sentence is all lost. Want peace becomes a very weak sentence. The want or the desire starts starving in the absence of the support of that I. That's what Sri Aurobindo has said, no? That the desires starve in the absence of support of the ego. When that want is also gone, the desire is gone, what is left behind is peace. So it's the ignorance that gives rise to the I leads to the want, and when the ignorance is gone, the I and the want are gone. Or as Patanjali said in that verse, avidya, asmita, ragadvesh, abhinivesha, klesha. The primary source of all klesha is avidya, ignorance. Ignorance of these basic facts of existence, of who I am and what I am here in the world for. Ignorance of that is what leads to the asmita, the ego sense, and it is that in turn which gives rise to desires and everything else that follows. Can end this with a little story again, which illustrates this inner renunciation. And there was a devotee of Krishna who once prepared food for a rishi. I think the rishi was Rishi Durvasa, who had suddenly come with a large troop of his retinue, with a large retinue, and the tradition in India was that if a Brahmin appears, you somehow have to make the food available. So she prepared the food, but then she had to cross a river or something to get there. And she started thinking, how will I cross this river? The river was suddenly in a fury. That stream was, or whatever it was, that rivulet was in a fury, and it became difficult for her to cross that. So she prayed to Krishna, and Krishna said, go in front of that river which you are finding it difficult to cross, and say, if Krishna is celibate, the river should go down, the fury should subside. She went and said that. The fury of the river subsided. She crossed and went to the other side and fed the rishi and all his retinue. And they ate heartily. It was a nice, delicious meal prepared with love. They ate with great gusto to their fill. And then it was time for her to come back. And once again the river was in a fury. So she now returned to that rishi. Now how can I go back? The river is again in a fury. And the rishi said, go in front of the river and say, if Durvasa is eternally fasting, please go down. It was quite amusing. The rishi had just eaten with such great gusto. He was not fasting, but that's what he said. So she went to the river and again said the same thing. If Rishi Durvasa is eternally fasting, go down. And the river lost its fury. It went down and she could easily cross the river. Now what this shows is that Krishna, who had so many gopis, if he could be eternally celibate, and Durvasa, who had just eaten such a hearty meal, could be eternally fasting, and that formula worked, what it means is that internally Krishna had overcome the desire, the type of desire one might have for all the gopis. And in the same way, the rishi had overcome the desire for food. So while he had to eat, eating is important. One can't live without food. But at the same time, he was not attached to the food. He had overcome it inwardly. So that is what inner renunciation is. Yeah, good questions. First, one general comment that sadhana is a process. It's not an event. And therefore, while we may understand all this at a mental level, we should not expect it to happen suddenly like an event. It's a gradual process. Secondly, about the possessions, as you said, that I feel attached to them. Now, here, it is again a process because a certain amount of fulfillment is necessary before we can achieve that inner renunciation. Like that chewing gum, the renunciation, the ability to throw away that comes only after one has extracted some juice out of it. Isn't it? So a certain amount of fulfillment of worldly desires is generally required before one can actually put that inner renunciation into practice. For example, there are two types of renunciation available in Mahabharata. One is the type of renunciation that Arjuna has achieved in the battlefield. I do not want this kingdom, I will not fight. Now, that is one type of renunciation. The other type of renunciation is the renunciation which Yudhishthira achieves after the battle has been won and he has sat on the throne for a few years. Now, there's a difference because the type of renunciation that Arjuna achieved is a type of an attack of renunciation, which comes as a result of an emotional upheaval at a certain stage, out of disgust, born out of disgust. And that type of an attack of renunciation comes to many people in the world when there's some acute suffering, some crisis, or something like that happens, or sometimes in a state of extreme good fortune. Now that I have achieved this, now I don't want anything more. No. I must give something back now that I have been so lucky. Now, this is an attack of renunciation which may or may not last very long. That is not true inner renunciation. Whereas the type of renunciation that Yudhishthira achieved is true inner renunciation because that was coupled with a certain amount of fulfillment. He did win the battle, he sat on the throne for a few years, then realized that this will not last forever and it cannot bring the type of happiness that turning to the divine will bring. And therefore, it was easy for him to give up the throne to Parikshit and retire and leave the kingdom. Now, therefore, a certain degree of fulfillment is required. So, with the worldly possessions in the same way, yes, right now you like and love and you feel possessive about many things, but gradually, as you get saturated, that fulfillment will eventually lead to a reduction in that attachment. Now, it comes to, you said, my near and dear ones when they are suffering. Now, once again, suffering is also a part of the process in the world. When one understands it, one can see that, suffering is universal. Suffering comes to everyone. We don't want anyone to suffer, but all the same, that has also been built into the world with a purpose. Because without that suffering, even this renunciation does not come. Because if everything were to go very well, renunciation would be far more difficult to achieve than if it was coupled with some suffering. And therefore, that's how the suffering or the pain paves the way for that renunciation. Initially, it may be the type of renunciation that comes out of disgust, the way it came to Arjuna. It may be only an attack of renunciation. But at least some taste of renunciation is better than no renunciation at all. And the beginning is often made with pain and suffering. And therefore, once we understand that purpose, certainly we would pray that their suffering ends as soon as possible, but we will not suffer because of it. Because having prayed that, yes, we wish that their suffering comes to an end, we will still leave it to the divine. The divine knows best. Because our prayers for the ending of their suffering are sure to be answered, but they'll be answered in His way and in His time, not ours. Yes, that's And the question is all ego bad? And if ego were all bad, it would not have been planted in us by the divine. The ego does have a very useful purpose till quite a late stage in life. The child, whatever worthwhile things the child does as growing up, whatever it tries to learn and do, all the good things it tries to learn, all the bad things it tries to avoid, all that is because of the child's ego. Even when a person is grown up, a lot that useful things that we do are born out of the ego because we have the satisfaction of having done something, having achieved something, having done some good, having earned some name and fame, whatever it is. So The ego does lead to a lot of useful activity in the world. The only thing is that there comes a point beyond which the ego becomes a barrier, and we start realizing that ego necessarily need not be the basis of worldly action. When we realize that the ego need not be the basis of worldly action, the basis can shift to a higher level, and the ego starts becoming a barrier to further spiritual progress, that is the time when the ego needs to be shed. Because the initial steps, even on the spiritual path, are taken, in fact, out of the ego. And when we know, for example, when I decide that what I have been doing is not something of lasting value, it's not something that is leading to spiritual progress, and that I need to do something different, I need to make a little shift in my life, once again it's the ego at work. I realize the drawbacks of what I am doing, I decide to make a shift, I decide to do something different, and therefore there's again the ego at work. So it's only when the ego starts becoming a barrier, and when does it become a barrier? It starts becoming a barrier when, because of this ego, I want to go further, but because of my attachment to my possessions, attachments to my relationships, I cannot go any further. That is the point when it becomes a barrier. And that is when this renunciation becomes necessary, and renouncing the ego becomes necessary. I said it's a process, it's not an event. It's a gradual process. Being on the right lines will make it easier, and the knowledge makes it easier. So all these are aids to that process. But certainly, it's a long time consuming process. It doesn't come suddenly. And when we do some good out of that ego, the world still gains a lot. The only thing is we do not get enough. We do not get the type of spiritual benefit that we could have got from the same work. And we suffer. For example, that old man I was talking about who started volunteering his time at the NGOs, whatever work he did, he still did help some people, but in the process, he suffered. Sure, that wider consciousness does put things in the perspective. And that wider consciousness comes through right action. That is one important way in which it can come. So as the consciousness widens, we start realizing the insignificance of what we are doing. We start seeing the whole, each individual and ourselves also as just one tiny cog in a large cog wheel, rather than start seeing that we are the wheel or we are turning it. No, when I said that we are often not fully aware of our own swabhava, I didn't mean that an engineer should suddenly start doing a doctor's work. That's not what I meant. Because besides the swabhava, there is also something called a swadharma. That is the type of circumstances and situations in which one has been placed, and doing the work accordingly. And yes, if the engineer is at a place where there is an emergency, and he knows a little bit about how to give artificial breathing, say, for example. Yes, at that time he does become a doctor, and that becomes his swadharma at that point in time under those circumstances, and therefore he can even sometimes overcome his swabhava. But that is not what I meant. What I meant was that within the same swabhava, and getting some clues from our swadharma, from the type of circumstances and conditions in which we have been placed, getting a clue from that, one can find that the types of things that we can do quite well is much wider than we think. And that applies even more to younger people than to people who are already highly qualified like you. Because what happens is that when a young person feels that, I wanted to get admission only to such and such course because this is the only thing I'll be able to do well, it is generally not an expression entirely of the swabhava of the child. It is often an expression of a mixed up thing of how the child's ego has been shaped by the environment. The mother says, There is in books a lot of talk about renunciation, that you must renounce possessions, renounce attachments, renounce desires. But I have come to the conclusion that so long as you have to renounce anything, you are not on this path, for so long as you are not thoroughly disgusted with things as they are and have to make an effort to reject them, you are not ready for the supramental realization. To renounce means that you are to give up what you value, that you have to discard what you think is worth keeping. What, on the contrary, you must feel is that this world is ugly, stupid, brutal, and full of intolerable suffering, and once you feel in this way, all the physical, all the material consciousness, which does not want it to be that, will want it to change, crying, I will have something else, something that is true, beautiful, full of delight and knowledge and consciousness.